1911, the beginning of a destiny. The ship's whistle pierced through the stillness of dawn, echoing across the Saigon River. The sun had yet to rise, but Nha Rong Wharf was already alive with the noise of footsteps, the creak of wooden carts, and the clatter of crates being loaded onto ships. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, coal smoke, and the faint aroma of brewed coffee drifting from a small stall nearby. Amid the bustling workers and stern-faced sailors stood a young man, slender, but with eyes that shone with an uncommon fire. His name was Nguyen Tat Than, a name that, decades later, the world would remember under a different one. He was only 21, dressed plainly in the work clothes of a ship's helper. To the casual observer, he looked no different from any other dock worker, but inside him burned a vision far greater than any outward appearance revealed. Behind him lay his homeland, bound and broken under the weight of French colonial rule. In front of him stretched the vast ocean, an uncertain, perilous expanse leading to foreign lands he had never seen. But for Than, the danger was worth it. He was not leaving to seek fortune, he was leaving to seek a way to save his country. Dock laborers, their backs bent under the crushing weight of cargo, shuffled past him, sweat streaking down their dirt-stained faces. Nearby, French officials in crisp white suits smoked cigars, their voices curt and commanding as they ordered colonial soldiers to guard the shipments. The contrast was stark. Wealth and power on one side, toil and misery on the other. Than's heart tightened. This must change, he thought. The merchant ship Amiral Latouche awaited departure. It would soon sail to France, carrying goods across half the world. Than had secured a humble position in the ship's kitchen as a cook's helper, a job that meant little to others. But to him, it was the first step toward a much larger mission. He had told no one the full extent of his plan. It was safer that way. Even to close friends, he simply said he wished to see the world. But in truth, he was going to search for an answer, a path that could free Vietnam from foreign domination. Before boarding, Than turned back for one last look, toward the north. In his mind, he saw the serene smile of his late mother, the resolute figure of his father, who had once served as a mandarin but resigned in protest, and the green fields of his childhood village, Lang Sen. Each memory was a spark, igniting his determination. A sailor's voice snapped him back to the present. "Hurry up, we're about to cast off." Than drew a deep breath. The sea ahead was endless, filled with storms and unknown dangers, but his resolve was firm. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the key to his nation's future. The ship trembled as the ropes were loosened. Slowly, the wharf began to slip away, the buildings of Saigon shrinking in the distance. Than gripped the railing tightly, the wind whipping against his face. In his heart, he made a silent vow. No matter how many years, no matter how many hardships, I will return. And I will return with freedom for my people. As the Amiral Latouche cut through the waters of the Saigon River and out toward the open sea, the journey of a young Vietnamese man seeking the path to liberation had begun. A journey that would change the fate of an entire nation. Chapter 2. The Years in Paris, 1917 to 1923. Awakening in the heart of the empire. The winter of 1917 wrapped Paris in a damp, grey chill. The city, though weary from years of war, still pulsed with energy, spilled golden light onto rain-slick cobblestones, the scent of roasted chestnuts mingling with the faint smoke of coal fires. But to Nguyen Tat Than, now calling himself Nguyen Ai Quack, Nguyen the Patriot, Paris was more than a city. It was the nerve center of an empire that ruled over millions, including his own people. He lived in a cramped attic in the Latin Quarter, the walls so thin the wind slipped through. His bed was a narrow cot, his possessions fitting into a single worn suitcase. By day, he labored wherever he could, sweeping the floors of a bakery before dawn, hauling sacks of coal to heat the apartments of the wealthy, scrubbing dishes in that bustled with laughter and clinking glasses. By night, he haunted the reading rooms of public libraries, devouring books in French, histories of revolutions, treatises on the rights of man, and the works of philosophers who dared to challenge kings. It was here that Nguyen first encountered the American Declaration of Independence and the slogans of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. The words stirred something deep inside him, but the hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. The same France that claimed to be the guardian of liberty kept Vietnam in chains. In 1919, the world's eyes turned to the Versailles Peace Conference. leaders of the victorious nations gathered to redraw the map after the Great War, promising self-determination for oppressed peoples. For Nguyen, this was a moment that could not be wasted. With fellow Vietnamese patriots, he drafted the 8 claims of the Anomati people, a respectful yet uncompromising plea for political freedoms, legal equality, and an end to racial discrimination in Indochina. He signed it Nguyen Ai Quoc, a name that would soon echo beyond the small circles of Vietnamese exiles. He delivered the petition to the conference delegates. Days turned into weeks. No reply came, no acknowledgement. The colonial masters who spoke so eloquently of freedom simply looked away. The silence was deafening, but it was also a turning point. Nguyen realized that petitions and polite appeals could not shake an empire. Change would require something far bolder. He began attending political meetings, at first sitting quietly in the back, then speaking more and more. In smoky and dim back rooms, he debated with French socialists, African dockworkers, and Caribbean seamen. They spoke of strikes, underground newspapers, and the shared struggle against imperialism. It was during these years that he discovered the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's essays on the national and colonial questions hit him with the force of revelation. The liberation of colonies was not charity. It was essential to the victory of workers everywhere. In 1920, at the Tours Congress of the French Socialist Party, Nguyen Ai Quoc took the floor. Speaking in calm, deliberate French, he urged the party to join the Communist International. His words carried across the hall, translated into multiple languages, igniting the attention of delegates. The vote passed, and Nguyen became one of the founding members of the French Communist Party, the first colonial subject to hold such a position. From that moment, his pen became a weapon. Writing for the newspaper Le Paria, the Pariah, he exposed the brutality of French rule in Vietnam, the forced labor on plantations, the land seizures that left peasants starving, the prisons where dissenters wasted away. His articles traveled far, reaching ports in Africa, streets in the Caribbean, and even the docks of Marseille, where colonial workers passed them hand to hand. Yet danger lurked in every shadow. Colonial agents followed him. Letters were intercepted. Friends whispered warnings that one day the police might come. But Nguyen pressed on. He had seen too much to turn back. On quiet nights, he would walk alone along the Seine. The reflections of Parisian lights rippled in the black water, and he would think of the Mekong, of the rice fields of Anh An, of his father's defiance and his mother's gentle strength. Somewhere, far across the seas, his homeland lay waiting in the dark. In Paris, Nguyen Ai Quoc had found the language of revolution, but more importantly, he had found his voice, and with it, the unshakable belief that Vietnam's freedom was not a dream. It was a mission. Chapter 3. Moscow and the Seeds of Revolution 1923-1924. Forging the revolutionary path. The train rattled through the snow-covered plains, its windows frosted from the breath of passengers huddled inside. Outside, the vast Russian landscape stretched endlessly, birch forests standing silent under the weight of winter. Inside one of the compartments, Nguyen Ai Quoc sat wrapped in a heavy coat, his eyes fixed on the blurred horizon. He was leaving Paris behind, heading toward the heart of a revolution that had already shaken the world, Moscow. It was 1923, barely 6 years after the Russian Revolution. The Soviet Union was still young, still raw, but its spirit was electric. Red banners draped across buildings, workers in thick coats bustled through the streets, and portraits of Lenin gazed down from every wall. This was not the opulence of Paris. This was a city built on struggle, sacrifice, and belief. Nguyen's arrival in Moscow was not by chance. He had been invited by the Communist International, the Comintern, to study revolutionary theory and practice. The Eastern Workers' Communist University KUTV became his new home, a place where revolutionaries from across Asia, Africa, and Latin America gathered under one roof. The classrooms smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. Chalk scraped across blackboards as professors explained Marxist theory, Leninist strategy, and the mechanics of dismantling colonial systems. Nguyen listened intently, filling notebooks with neat handwriting in French, underlining phrases that spoke to his mission: organization, discipline, education of the masses. Outside of lectures, Nguyen sought out conversations with his fellow students. He met Indian activists dreaming of breaking the British Raj, Chinese revolutionaries plotting to end the rule of warlords, Korean patriots resisting Japanese occupation. Around small stoves in cold dormitories, they traded stories of injustice and hope, their breath visible in the freezing air. From them, Nguyen learned something vital. Vietnam's struggle was not an isolated flame. It was part of a great fire spreading across the colonial world. In July 1924, the Grand Hall of the Kuomintang Congress was heavy with anticipation. Delegates from every continent sat beneath the tall ceilings, their voices hushed. When Nguyen Ai Quoc stepped up to the podium, he was calm but resolute. Speaking in French, his words were translated into Russian and other languages. Colonialism is a parasite. It feeds on the blood of the people and drains their dignity. The liberation of the colonies is not an act of kindness. It is a necessity for the victory of the workers everywhere. The hall erupted in applause. For many, it was the first time they had heard the voice of a Vietnamese revolutionary. Life in Moscow was harsh. The winters were brutal, food sometimes scarce, yet Nguyen thrived. He studied Soviet propaganda, how posters, songs, and newspapers stirred millions into action. He attended workers' rallies, saw how discipline and unity could become a weapon as powerful as any rifle. Here, he refined his vision. Vietnam's liberation would demand more than courage. It would require a movement, trained, organized, and united under a clear ideology. By late 1924, his time in Moscow was drawing to an end. The Kuomintang gave him a mission in Asia, to go to Guangzhou, China, where anti-imperialist movements were gathering momentum and Vietnamese exiles were eager for leadership. On his final night in Moscow, Nguyen stood on a bridge over the frozen Moskva River. Snowflakes landed softly on his coat, melting into dark spots. The Kremlin towers loomed in the distance, their red stars glowing faintly in the cold. He thought of the path that had brought him here, from the humid docks of Saigon to the crowded streets of Paris, and now to the frozen heart of a global revolution. The journey was far from over. The seeds he carried were ready to be planted. Turning away from the river, he walked into the darkness, already seeing in his mind the faces of the men and women who would one day fight beside him for Vietnam's freedom. Chapter 4. Guangzhou. Building the first revolutionary cadres, 1924-1927. Planting the seeds of a movement. The air in Guangzhou was thick with humidity and the scent of incense from nearby temples. Rickshaws clattered over cobblestones, street vendors shouted prices for bowls of steaming noodles, and the Pearl River shimmered under the afternoon sun. The city was alive, but beneath its bustling surface, it was a hotbed of political tension. When Nguyen Ai Quoc arrived in late 1924, he carried with him more than a suitcase. He brought a vision sharpened in Paris, tested in Moscow, and ready to take root in Asia. Guangzhou, then a center of revolutionary activity under Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang government, was a crossroads for exiles, activists, and dreamers. Here, Nguyen saw an opening to train the future leaders of Vietnam's liberation. He found lodging in a modest building near the heart of the city, blending easily into the mix of Chinese, Southeast Asian, and European faces. The Kuomintang had arranged his presence discreetly. His mission was clear: gather young Vietnamese patriots, teach them revolutionary theory, and prepare them to return home as organizers. Through contacts among dockworkers, printers, and merchants, Nguyen began quietly seeking out Vietnamese living in southern China. Many were students or workers who had fled French repression. Others were soldiers who had deserted the colonial army. In small rooms lit by oil lamps, Nguyen spoke to them about the world he had seen. The strikes in Paris, the congresses in Moscow, the principles of Marx and Lenin. One evening, he addressed a gathering of just 7 young men, their faces lit by the flicker of a single candle. You are not just here to escape oppression, you are here to prepare for the day we return to free our homeland. To fight, you must know why you fight. To win, you must fight as one. He opened notebooks filled with careful handwriting in French and Chinese, translating key concepts into simple Vietnamese so that every word could be understood. He spoke not only of ideology, but of discipline, the need for secrecy, unity, and trust. By early 1925, Nguyen had formed the Vietnam Revolutionary Youth League Than Nien. The group was small, but each member was trained in both theory and practical skills: how to organize strikes, distribute leaflets, and speak to peasants and workers in language that moved hearts as well as minds. In rented classrooms above tea houses, he used chalk to draw maps of Vietnam, marking the regions where resistance could grow. He explained how the peasants were the backbone of the struggle, how workers in cities could disrupt the colonial economy, and how both needed to be united under a single revolutionary banner. Nguyen also maintained close ties with Chinese revolutionaries. He attended lectures by Soviet advisors, met with members of the Kuomintang's left wing, and watched as China itself was swept into a wave of political change. These alliances gave him resources, protection, and a network that stretched beyond borders. But danger was never far. French intelligence agents operated in Guangzhou, hunting for signs of anti-colonial plots. Kuomintang factions clashed violently, and the city often teetered on the brink of chaos. Nguyen learned to move carefully, changing meeting locations frequently, using coded messages, and keeping the identities of his students secret even from each other. In 1926, tragedy struck. Sun Yat-sen died, and political instability deepened. The fragile alliance between the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists began to unravel. Streets once filled with hopeful rallies now echoed with gunfire as rival factions fought for control. Nguyen knew time was running short. He intensified the training of his cadres, urging them to return to Vietnam in small groups. Some went north to Tonkin, others south to Cochin China, each carrying instructions, contacts, and the conviction that freedom was within reach. By mid-1927, the political climate in Guangzhou had turned dangerous for foreign revolutionaries. Under threat of arrest, or worse, Nguyen left the city quietly, boarding a small coastal vessel under an assumed name. As the boat pulled away from the harbor, he stood at the stern, watching Guangzhou fade into the haze. He had arrived with nothing but ideas. He was leaving having planted the roots of an organization that, in time, would grow into the backbone of Vietnam's independence movement. The seeds had been sown. Now, they would have to survive the storm. Chapter 5. Across Asia. Networks of Resistance 1927-1929. A revolutionary without borders. The deck of the small coastal steamer creaked beneath Nguyen Ai Kwok's feet as it cut through the waves of the South China Sea. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke. He stood at the railing, coat pulled tight against the spray, eyes fixed on the hazy horizon. Behind him lay Guangzhou, now unstable and dangerous for revolutionaries. Ahead lay a journey without a fixed map, a mission that would take him across Asia in search of allies, resources, and safe ground from which to continue the fight. Shanghai, city of spies and secrets. His first stop was Shanghai, a city where modern skyscrapers loomed over narrow alleys, and rickshaws jostled with motors. Here, East met West, and every political current in the world seemed to flow through its crowded streets. Shanghai was a magnet for exiles, merchants, and spies. The French, British, and Japanese all had concessions, each with their own police and informants. Secret societies thrived in the shadows, and revolutionary groups operated under constant threat. Nguyen moved carefully, meeting contacts in tea houses, back rooms of print shops, and the noisy chaos of open-air markets, where conversations could blend into the crowd. He made contact with Chinese communists, who had survived the recent political purges, arranging safe passage for Vietnamese cadres, moving between China and Indochina. Every handshake, every hushed conversation, was part of a larger web, a network of resistance that spanned borders. Siam, Thailand, hidden among the Vietnamese diaspora by late 1927, Nguyen crossed into Siam, traveling under an assumed name. Here, in rural provinces along the Mekong River, he found thousands of Vietnamese migrants, farmers, fishermen, traders, many of whom had fled oppressive taxes and land seizures under French rule. Nguyen saw an opportunity. Disguised as a teacher, he began holding literacy classes that doubled as political education. Lessons in reading and writing Vietnamese became lessons in history and revolution. He taught the story of the Trung sisters, the Can Vuong movement, and the struggles of workers in Saigon's factories. Slowly, he built a network of trusted supporters, using local temples, markets, and river ports as meeting points. Messages were hidden inside sacks of rice, or passed from boat to boat along the Mekong. Hong Kong, the safe harbor that wasn't in 1929, Nguyen moved to Hong Kong, then under British control. At first, it seemed a safe base, a bustling port with a vibrant press and a degree of political openness. But colonial police were everywhere, and French agents operated freely. Still, Hong Kong provided something crucial: proximity to Vietnam. From here, Nguyen coordinated the smuggling of leaflets, newspapers, and instructions into the country. He also maintained correspondence with comrades in Moscow and the Comintern, ensuring the Vietnamese struggle remained part of the global revolutionary agenda. It was in Hong Kong that he learned of growing tensions within the Vietnam Revolutionary Youth League. Younger, more impatient members wanted to form a formal communist party immediately, while others urged caution. Nguyen knew the moment was approaching when ideological debate would give way to decisive action. The road ahead, life on the run, had hardened him. He slept in crowded hostels, in the back rooms of sympathetic shopkeepers, even on the decks of cargo boats. His belongings were few: a small suitcase, a worn coat, notebooks filled with coded names and instructions. But everywhere he went, Nguyen left something behind: trained cadres, organized cells, and the belief that Vietnam's liberation was not just possible, but inevitable. By the close of 1929, the pieces were in place. Networks stretched from Siam to Shanghai, from Hong Kong to Hanoi. The next step would be bold, risky, and irreversible: the formation of a unified Communist Party to lead the struggle for independence. Nguyen Ai Quoc was ready, and so was history. Chapter 6: The Birth of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, 1930. A movement takes its true form. The humid air of Hong Kong clung to everything: clothes, paper, even breath. The British port city bustled with noise and movement: steamships docking, dockworkers shouting in Cantonese, the clang of metal on metal from shipyards. But inside a modest apartment on Kowloon's outskirts, the noise of the city faded into silence. It was February 1930, and in that quiet room, a new chapter of Vietnam's struggle was about to be written. The gathering Nguyen Ai Quoc had called together representatives from 3 separate revolutionary organizations: the Annam Communist Party, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party original faction, and the Communist League of Indochina. They arrived one by one, some in workmen's clothes, others in plain Chinese tunics, to avoid suspicion. Each had risked arrest, even death, to make this journey. Nguyen greeted them with a firm handshake, his eyes searching each face. He knew the stakes. Unity was no longer a dream, it was a necessity. Division had weakened the movement before. Now, the cause demanded one voice, one flag. The words that united them. The meeting began with reports from inside Vietnam. The news was grim: strikes in textile factories crushed by police, peasant protests in Anh An and Ha Tin met with gunfire, arrests, torture, executions. The French colonial regime was tightening its grip, but Nguyen saw something else in these reports: proof that the people were ready to rise. Unfolding a set of handwritten notes, he began to speak. Our enemy is powerful, but not invincible. What they fear most is unity. We must be one organization, one movement, guided by one program, the program of revolution. He laid out a platform: overthrow French imperialism and its collaborators, confiscate land from landlords for the peasants, establish an independent workers' and peasants' government, work for solidarity with oppressed peoples worldwide. The words were simple, but the conviction behind them was steel. The birth of the party debates followed, over tactics, priorities, even the name of the new organization. Voices rose, hands slammed on the table, but Nguyen kept the discussion focused. By the end of the meeting, they reached agreement. The 3 groups would merge into a single body: the Communist Party of Vietnam, later known as the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. A declaration was drafted, outlining their goals and their vision for a free Vietnam. Nguyen wrote carefully, each word chosen for both clarity and inspiration. When the final version was read aloud, the room fell silent. One by one, each delegate signed the document. Beyond the room from that day, a new chain of command was established. Messengers carried coded instructions into Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina. Leaflets were printed on hidden presses in Chaoan and smuggled upriver in fishing boats. The French colonial police soon caught wind of the change. Raids intensified. Arrests multiplied. But the movement no longer had splintered leadership. It had a single, organized brain directing its limbs. Nguyen's resolve late that night. After the others had left, Nguyen sat alone at the small wooden table. A single oil lamp lit the room, its flame wavering in the humid air. On the table lay the signed declaration, the birth certificate of the party. He knew what it meant. The road ahead would be bloodier, more dangerous than anything before. But for the first time, Vietnam's fight had a united, disciplined, revolutionary leadership. Looking out through the small window toward the dark harbor, he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." Chapter 7, The Anh Tin Uprising, 1930-1931, Flames of Revolt. The summer heat in Anh An was relentless. The rice fields shimmered under the sun, and the air carried the heavy scent of ripening grain. But beneath the ordinary rhythms of rural life, something extraordinary was stirring. In villages across Anh An and Ha Tin, whispers passed from mouth to mouth, carried by traders, farmhands, and teachers. The new Communist Party was calling for action. The spark. By mid-1930, news of strikes and protests had begun to spread. In Vinh, factory workers walked off the job, demanding better wages and an end to brutal working conditions. In the countryside, peasants gathered in secret meetings, speaking openly about rent reductions and land redistribution. The French colonial authorities, sensing trouble, sent police and soldiers to intimidate the villagers. But instead of retreating, the people's anger deepened. On a humid morning in August, the spark became a flame. In Du Luong, thousands of peasants marched toward the district headquarters. They carried red banners, their bare feet kicking up dust. Some sang revolutionary songs, others chanted slogans demanding justice. The red villages, when police opened fire, killing several protesters, the movement exploded. Across Anh An and Ha Tin, villagers drove out local officials, tore down tax records, and set up peasant soviets, self-governing councils that redistributed land, organized communal work, and taught literacy. In these red villages, French-appointed mandarins were replaced by elected leaders, chosen from among the peasants. The Vietnamese tricolor of the colonial administration was lowered. The red flag of revolution was raised in its place. For a brief moment, the vision Nguyen Ai Quoc had carried across continents flickered into reality. Ordinary farmers and laborers ruled their own communities, free from the whip of the landlord and the orders of the colonial clerk. The response, but the French colonial regime could not allow such defiance to stand. In late 1930, reinforcements poured into the provinces, colonial troops, artillery, and aircraft. Villages were bombed from the air, homes were burned, entire communities were forced to flee into the hills. The repression was swift and merciless. Thousands were arrested, tortured, or executed. By early 1931, the Anh Tin Soviets had been crushed. The fields that once echoed with songs of liberation now lay silent, dotted with the ashes of burned homes. Nguyen's reflection from his base outside Vietnam. Nguyen Ai Quoc received the news in fragments, smuggled letters, whispered reports from couriers. The uprising had been both a triumph and a tragedy. It proved that the people of Vietnam were willing to rise up, to take power into their own hands, but it also showed the brutal efficiency of the colonial machine and the cost of confronting it head-on, without sufficient preparation. Nguyen studied the lessons carefully. The party would need to survive, even under the harshest repression. It would have to be more disciplined, more clandestine, and more deeply rooted in the daily lives of the people. The dream had not died in Anh Tin. It had simply gone underground, waiting for the next time it could rise. Chapter 8, Exile and Imprisonment, 1931-1933, The Shadow of the Noose. The humid summer of 1931 in Hong Kong brought with it an air heavy enough to cling to the skin. The narrow streets of Kowloon were alive with hawkers, the clatter of rickshaws, and the smell of frying noodles. But for Nguyen Ai Quoc, the city had become a cage without bars. For months, British colonial police had been watching him. French intelligence agents lurked in the background, eager to capture the man who had united Vietnam's revolutionaries and sparked the Anh Tin Soviets. The French wanted him alive, but only long enough to stage a trial and an execution. The arrest had happened before dawn. Nguyen had just finished reviewing coded messages from comrades inside Vietnam, when a pounding shook the door. Before he could hide the papers, British officers burst in, revolvers drawn. They searched the small apartment with mechanical precision, overturning drawers, tearing open bedding. A stack of handwritten notes in Vietnamese and French was seized. His personal effects, few as they were tossed into a canvas bag. Hands-bound Nguyen was marched through the waking streets, his presence attracting the curious stares of early morning vendors. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to give his captors the satisfaction of seeing fear. The prison cell inside Victoria Prison, The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew and sweat. Nguyen's cell was a narrow box with a thin mat on the stone floor, and a barred window too high to reach. Meals were bowls of thin rice gruel. Nights were filled with the groans of other prisoners and the clank of boots in the corridor. But even in isolation, Nguyen's mind was at work. He replayed the last few years in his head: the unification of the party, the uprising in Engtin, the networks across Asia. The question was not whether the struggle would continue, but how it would survive without him. The legal battle. The French colonial authorities wasted no time. They formally requested Nguyen's extradition, eager to see him hanged in Hanoi. In their eyes, he was not a political leader. He was a criminal, guilty of sedition and treason. But Nguyen had allies. British lawyers, sympathetic to anti-colonial causes, took up his case, arguing that he was a political refugee and could not be legally sent to a country where execution was certain. The battle moved from the courtroom to the press. Articles in British and Chinese newspapers began to appear, painting Nguyen Ai Quoc as a freedom fighter rather than a fugitive. Public sympathy began to grow, complicating the French demand. The disappearance in 1932, after more than a year behind bars, Nguyen was suddenly moved. Guards escorted him from the prison under the pretense of a transfer, and then, without explanation, he was gone. To the French, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. In truth, a quiet arrangement had been made. Nguyen was released into a kind of shadow exile, forced to leave Hong Kong, but spared from extradition. He emerged frail, his health weakened by imprisonment, but his resolve intact. The months in confinement had stripped away any illusions he still held about the colonial powers. He had seen their fear, and their fear confirmed his path was the right one. A man still in the fight, Nguyen slipped out of Hong Kong under an assumed identity, moving quietly through southern China. Every step had to be calculated. French agents still hunted him, and the Kuomintang's shifting politics made China a dangerous refuge. Yet in exile, he continued to write, to send guidance to the underground networks in Vietnam, and to rebuild the connections that prison had disrupted. The British had thought they were removing a problem from their territory. The French had hoped to end a life. Instead, both had released a man who would not stop until his homeland was free. Chapter 9. Return to China's revolutionary hubs, 1934-1938. Rebuilding in the shadows. The winter wind cut through the narrow alleys of Shanghai, carrying with it the distant clang of shipyard hammers and the soft hum of street vendors' calls. For Nguyen Ai Quoc, returning to China after years of exile and imprisonment was both a risk and a necessity. The French still hunted him. British intelligence had not forgotten his name. In Vietnam, the party had been battered by arrests and executions. Many leaders were dead, imprisoned, or driven underground. Yet here, in China's revolutionary cities, Nguyen saw the last flickers of a network that could be revived, rebuilding the links. Shanghai, Guangzhou, and the southern ports were alive with whispers of war. Japan's armies were tightening their grip on Manchuria, and tensions in China were approaching breaking point. Amid the chaos, Nguyen began searching for old comrades, those who had survived the purges and crackdowns. Some he found running small print shops, quietly producing leaflets for Chinese trade unions. Others worked in dockside warehouses, blending in with the laborers by day and meeting in hidden rooms by night. Over bowls of tea in dimly lit rooms, Nguyen listened more than he spoke. He mapped who could be trusted, which routes were safe, and where supplies could be moved without detection. Slowly, a web began to form again, fragile but growing. The Kuomintang communist rift. China itself was changing. The uneasy alliance between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party was fracturing again, and political assassinations were becoming common. Nguyen knew the danger firsthand. Several times he had to change lodgings overnight when police raids came too close. Yet he navigated the shifting alliances with care, maintaining working relations with both sides when it served the Vietnamese cause. For him, ideology mattered, but survival and the continuity of the movement came first. Training the new wave by 1936, Nguyen had established a small training circle in Guangzhou. The students were younger now, many in their early 20s, but they carried the same fire he had seen in the first generation of cadres a decade earlier. He taught them in the same way he always had, not only with theory, but with stories. Stories of Paris strikes, Moscow congresses, and the peasant councils of He spoke of mistakes made, of comrades lost, and of the discipline required to survive. In a cramped, rented room, maps of Vietnam were spread on the floor, stones holding down the curling edges. Nguyen used his finger to trace the rivers, the mountains, the railway lines, explaining how the geography itself could be turned into a weapon against the French. War on the horizon. The shadow of a greater conflict loomed. In 1937, Japanese forces pushed deeper into China, launching full-scale war. Bombing raids struck Guangzhou, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. Streets filled with refugees carrying bundles of possessions, and once busy markets, became scenes of desperation. For Nguyen, the war was both a threat and an opportunity. The French colonial regime, distracted by the global turmoil, might loosen its grip at home. But Japanese expansion in Asia was a new danger, one that could just as easily swallow Vietnam as it had parts of China. The plan to return by late 1938, Nguyen was convinced. He could no longer stay on the sidelines. The Vietnamese movement needed its leaders on home soil, not only to inspire, but to reorganize the fight. From a small riverside safehouse, he drafted letters in invisible ink, sending word to trusted comrades in Tonkin and Annam. Prepare for my return. As he packed his few belongings, worn notebooks, maps, and the same battered suitcase he had carried since Paris, Nguyen looked out at the muddy Pearl River. He had spent decades moving across the world, gathering knowledge and building networks. Now, it was time to bring it all back to the place where his journey had begun. The next chapter would not be written in exile. It would be written in Vietnam. Chapter 10. Return to Vietnam and the Viet Minh's Phi, 1941. Lighting the torch, the jungle air of Cao Bằng was thick with mist and the scent of wet earth. Cicadas droned in the canopy above, and the steady drip of rainwater from the leaves echoed like a slow heartbeat. It was February 1941, and for the first time in more than 30 years, Nguyen Ai Quoc was back on Viet. He moved cautiously along a narrow mountain trail, guided by local cadres. The journey from China had been dangerous. French patrols guarded the border, and Japanese troops now occupied much of Indochina. But the risk was worth it. After decades abroad, Nguyen had returned not as a lone patriot, but as a sea zone. A homeland in Vietnam, in 1941, was under two masters. The French Colo still claimed. Nguyen saw villages where children's ribs showed through their skin, where mothers traded heirlooms for handfuls of grain. The anger was there. The Pac Bo cave deep in the mountains. Nguyen established a base in Pac Bo, ALH. The birth of the Viet Minh in May. Nguyen spoke plainly. Our pay that banner would be the Vietnam Doc, Lap Dong Minh Hoi, Thi Viet Minh League for the Eye organizing. The Viet Minh's strategy began in the villages. Cadres fanned out through the mountains and valleys, teaching literacy, distributing leaflets, and explaining the goals of the movement. Farmers were shown how to hide rice from Japanese requisitions, how to set up watchposts, and how to send messages using coded signals. Nguyen's stressed disc, a growing. By late 1941, small Viet Minh units were already clashing with French and Japanese patrols in the highlands. Villagers began to shelter fighters, share food, and pass on intelligence. The movement's red and gold star flag appeared in remote markets, a quiet but powerful symbol that hope was. From his desk in Pac Bo, Nguyen wrote leaflets, trained new leaders, and drafted a program for national liberation. At night, he would step outside the cave, looking across the dark mountains toward the lowlands. Somewhere beyond those hills lay Hanoi, Saigon. He knew the war. Chapter 11. Guerrilla War Against Two Empires, 1941 to 1945. The road to August. The mountains of northern Vietnam were alive with movement. Trails once walked only by hunters and traders now carried couriers, armed patrols, and columns of young men and women marching under the red flag with the gold star. From his base in Pac Bo, Nguyen Ai Quoc, now known to his comrades simply as Uncle Ho, watched the transformation of the Viet Minh from a hidden network into a fighting force. It was still small compared to the armies of the French and Japanese, but it had something the occupiers lacked: the trust of the people. Two masters, one enemy. Vietnam in the early 1940s was a land caught between two empires. The French colonial regime clung to its authority, extracting taxes and resources to feed the war in Europe. The Japanese army, having seized control in 1940, used Vietnam as a supply base for its conquests in Southeast Asia. To the Viet Minh, It made little difference which foreign flag flew over the garrisons. Both were occupiers. Both would have to go. The guerrilla strategy, Ho Chi Minh and the leadership crafted a plan built on mobility, secrecy, and the element of surprise. Small units, often no more than a dozen fighters, would strike at night, sabotaging railway lines, ambushing supply convoys, and attacking isolated outposts before melting back into the jungle. Weapons were scarce. Many fighters began with nothing more than machetes, spears, or captured rifles. Ammunition was precious. Every bullet was counted, every shot deliberate. But the lack of firepower was offset by the deep knowledge of the terrain and the support of villagers who provided food, shelter, and warnings of enemy movements. The Japanese famine in 1944, disaster struck the countryside. The Japanese requisitioned vast amounts of rice to feed their troops, destroying dikes to force farmers to grow jute for military use. Combined with poor harvests, the result was catastrophic famine. In Tonkin alone, more than 1 million people would die of hunger. The Viet Minh responded by organizing grain raids against Japanese storehouses, redistributing rice to starving villages. For many peasants, this was their first direct contact with the movement, and it turned sympathy into loyalty. The Viet Minh became not just a force of resistance, but a lifeline. The liberation zones. By late 1944, the resistance controlled pockets of territory in the northern highlands. In these liberated zones, the Viet Minh set up schools, ran literacy classes, and organized agricultural cooperatives. Taxes collected by the French or Japanese were replaced with contributions to the resistance. In December, Ho Chi Minh ordered the creation of the Vietnam Propaganda Liberation Army Team, a small but disciplined corps that would grow into the People's Army of Vietnam. The tide turns as 1945 approached. The World War was shifting. The Japanese were retreating across the Pacific under relentless Allied attacks. In Europe, the Nazis were collapsing. Ho Chi Minh knew the moment was coming, a moment when imperial control over Vietnam would falter, and the people could seize their destiny. From a hidden camp, he addressed his fighters. The time we have waited for is near. When the enemy is weak, we must be strong. When they stumble, we must strike. Every village, every field, every heart must rise together. The jungle echoed with the sounds of preparation, the hammering of bamboo spears, the sharpening of blades. The whispered instructions passed from one cadre to another. The Viet Minh were ready. The next step would not be skirmishes in the mountains. It would be a national uprising. Chapter 12. The August Revolution, August 1945. The moment seized. Hanoi, in the summer of 1945, was a city on the edge of history. The air was heavy with monsoon rain and the murmurs of a restless people. Japan's empire was crumbling after years of war, its armies retreating across the Pacific. In Vietnam, the Japanese occupation was faltering, and the French colonial regime had been weakened beyond repair. For Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, the moment they had waited for over 30 years had finally arrived. The power vacuum. On August 15, 1945, news crackled across hidden radios in mountain hideouts and village squares. Japan had surrendered to the Allies. In the cities, Japanese garrisons stood confused, awaiting orders that never came. In the countryside, French administrators, once feared, had lost their authority. For the first time in living memory, there was no clear master in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh knew this window would not last. If the Viet Minh did not move now, others, perhaps the returning French, would seize control. The call to uprising. On August 13th, in a hidden mountain base, the Viet Minh National Congress convened. Ho Chi Minh, thin from years of hardship but burning with resolve, stood before the delegates. The Japanese have surrendered. The French are weak. This is our chance, perhaps our only chance, to take our country back. We must act before the enemy regains strength. We must rise as one nation. Orders went out that very night. Messengers on bicycles, on foot, and in sampan boats carried the signal to every province: prepare for insurrection. The wave of revolution from August 14th to August 18th, towns and provinces across the country erupted. Viet Minh cadres led crowds into district offices, police stations, and garrisons. Japanese troops, unwilling to fight after their surrender, stood aside. Local officials either fled or joined the revolution. In Hue, the imperial capital, Emperor Bao Dai's court was surrounded by protesters demanding his abdication. In the south, Saigon streets filled with demonstrators waving red flags with the gold star. Hanoi was next. Hanoi, August 19th. The morning was overcast, but the streets swelled with tens of thousands. Farmers in conical hats walked beside students in white shirts. Veterans of the guerrilla war marched alongside women carrying infants. They carried banners calling for independence, their voices rising in chants that echoed off the colonial buildings. The Viet Minh took over key positions: the post office, the treasury, the police headquarters. The Japanese did not resist. By evening, the red and gold flag flew over the heart of Hanoi. The proclamation on September 2nd, 1945, in Ba Dinh Square, a sea of people gathered under the hot midday sun. Ho Chi Minh, wearing a simple khaki suit, stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent. Unfolding a sheet of paper, he began, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He had borrowed the opening from the American Declaration of Independence, and then, in a steady voice, he declared Vietnam's own. Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact, it is so already. The entire Vietnamese people are determined to bring their energy, their lives, and their wealth to maintain this independence and liberty. Cheers erupted, rolling through the crowd like a wave. After decades of struggle, the nation had declared itself free.